Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is full of mistruths, prejudice, and blatant anti-Israel bias, having reached a tipping point during and in the aftermath of the 2021 Israel-Palestinian conflict, Gaza. Tired of the false anti-Semitic narrative, Dr. Jonathan Chandser, Senior Vice President of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, decided to write a book, Gaza Conflict 2021, which gives the violence, historical, geopolitical, and other important context. Well, we're fortunate to have Jonathan with us today to discuss critical Middle East policy concerns, including the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly as social media evolves and clouds the picture, potential U.S. entry back into the JCPOA agreement with Iran, and anti-Israel sentiment in American politics, and the elusive goal of peace and stability in the region. We'll also touch upon how Russian aggression and its invasion of Ukraine is affecting Israel and its neighbors. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He's also held previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. Jonathan has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, testifies frequently before Congress, and publishes widely in the American and international media, appearing on channels such as CNN, Fox News, and Al Jazeera. Jonathan, glad to have you back with us today. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you.
Well, before we talk about your book, Gaza Conflict 2021, I'd like to hear your analysis on the news of the moment, which is the war in Ukraine, and what geopolitical and security ramifications might there be for the Middle East, especially for Israel and Europe. Really, your thoughts on this unprovoked aggression overall and where we may be headed would certainly be of interest to our listeners. So have at it.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Look, I first say I'm not a Russia specialist. I know there are a lot of sudden experts on Twitter and around the Beltway right now. So I want to be modest in terms of how I view that conflict through that lens. I will say, though, that my assessment thus far is that this is far from over. I think we've heard a lot of sanguine projections about how the Ukrainians are going to hold out, or they're delivering punishing blows to Putin's military, which certainly does look weaker than maybe some expected. I would just say, I would warn that Putin has many more tools in his toolbox. He can deploy aggressive cyber means. He obviously has tactical nukes and other tools that he can use. And I don't think he's particularly fearful of the international condemnation that he's received, and doesn't seem to be moved by sanctions for that matter. So I think there are challenges ahead for the West, for NATO, as the United States in particular thinks about how it is going to continue to support and buttress the US-led world order. I will say that I just returned from a trip to Israel and I had some fascinating conversations there, really right as the war erupted. And one of the things that I am struck by right now is the impossible position that Israel finds itself. Of course, we have to go back to 2013 to look at the origins of the story, but this was when the Obama administration decided not to uphold its so-called red line after the Bashar al-Assad regime wielded chemical weapons against its own people in Syria. It was at that point that the Obama administration elected not to intervene, and Putin saw an opportunity to step into the void. He did so and has since controlled the skies over Syria with his advanced S-400 anti-aircraft system. This has made things extremely complicated for Israel, particularly as Iran, beginning somewhere around 2015, began to launch an effort to smuggle what we describe as PGMs, precision-guided munitions, to Hezbollah. These weapons are incredibly dangerous. They're advanced. Never before have we seen them in the hands of non-state actors. And this would enable Hezbollah, with enough numbers, to be able to target high-value assets inside Israel. And by that, I'm talking about the nuclear facility in Dimona, the chemical plant in Haifa, the Kiryat, the so-called Pentagon of Israel in Tel Aviv, bases all around the country. Hezbollah would be able to strike them accurately and with a larger payload. This is a grave danger to Israel. It needs the ability to intervene in Syria, and where most of these weapons are being transited through. This means that Israel has needed a deconfliction mechanism with Putin. If Israel chooses to really heap on the pressure against Russia, along the lines of what we see here out of the United States, and along the lines of what the United States is asking of Israel, Israel could lose access to the skies over Syria. Putin could simply refuse to allow the Israelis to operate there. This would put Israel in a position where it would have to fight a horrific war in probably a fairly short amount of time. And so the Israelis are struggling with how to be on the right side of history on the one hand, while also protecting their national interests on the other. Complicating matters further is the fact that there are oligarchs that have established some assets inside of Israel. Some of them have Israeli citizenship. Some of them are Jewish and are welcomed pursuant to the Israeli law of return. So we have some very interesting complications there. Adding to even that, the Israelis lack a sanctions authority against countries with whom they are not at war. So they are now scrambling to come up with even a bureaucratic solution to some of the demands being made by the United States. And assuming that Israel does all of that and is able to balance these needs and even is able to broker some kind of calm or even a ceasefire between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which is what Bennett is trying to do right now, what they will be thanked with at the end of this appears to be an Iran nuclear deal that effectively undermines Israeli interests. So it is a bleak picture right now in Israel, to put it mildly, but they are working through all of these challenges and hopefully will come out okay on the other side.
Yeah, I think it is. Israel's dilemma is really unique in the international community. I don't think, I think about the vote in the UN General Assembly on the Russian invasion, and it was, I think, 149-5 with 35 abstentions. But no country really has this dilemma because of what is going on Israel's northern border, both in Syria and in Lebanon. But you mentioned an Iran nuclear deal, so let's move to that if we can, just before we talk about the book. I think there may be some misconceptions out there. When there was a discussion about going back into a negotiation with the Iranians, making it longer and stronger, a lot of folks just assume, well, this is going to be a new negotiation, and it will be able to cover all of these issues, malign behavior, even human rights issues. But that's really not the case. What we're doing here is, after the Trump administration left the JCPOA in 2018, we're actually negotiating in Vienna to go back into the JCPOA. So, and then the assumption is, maybe there'll be a negotiation after that, but most likely not, because the Iranians are looking to get as much as they can out of Vienna. Where do you see the Vienna talks today, and what do you think about what many people are referring to a priori as a horrible deal?
So we've watched this process play out in Vienna for quite some time now, and it's become rather obvious, I think, to all watching with even let's just say, passive interest, that Rob Malley, the chief negotiator, is caving to basically every demand made by the Iranians. And actually, I think making it even more complicated is the fact that it's the Russian mediator, Mikhail Ulyanov, who's been the go-between. So you have a Russian diplomat that is effectively paving the way for the concessions that Malley has made. What we understand is that it is the core structure is about returning to the JCPOA and its original timetable of lapsing restrictions, which is highly problematic given that, just for example, next year you have the restriction on ballistic missiles set to expire. And then shortly after that, you'll begin to see what is commonly referred to as the sunsets on the uranium enrichment caps and things along those lines. They're going to begin to evaporate as well, meaning that in probably maybe 6 years or even less, you will see what we often refer to as a paved pathway to a legitimized nuclear program for Iran. So you have the kind of the original structure, which is problematic in its own right. And now, from what we understand that has been negotiated in Vienna, it appears that there are other concessions on the table, namely the removal of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, removing of sanctions, the removal of the FTO sanctions against the IRGC, Foreign Terrorist Organization. This is a huge concession. It, of course, legitimizes a paramilitary unit that Iran uses to carry out terrorist attacks around the world and to support a wide range of terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, etc. On top of that, we will see very likely the delisting of serial human rights abusers, including Ibrahim Raisi, the president of the Islamic Republic, who is responsible for thousands of deaths in the 1980s, killing a campaign of killing dissidents. We will see the lifting of sanctions against the Supreme Leader's Slush Fund, otherwise known as ICO. This means that the Supreme Leader will be able to throw money around the region to bad actors and to support the Islamic Republic's aims. And then perhaps there are two other very worrying developments that are worth noting. One is that it appears there is pressure right now, pursuant to the deal, to close the file on outstanding nuclear questions at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. So in other words, all of these sort of technical issues that remain unanswered about the military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program, secret facilities that were hidden from the public eye deliberately by the Iranians, these files are likely to be closed. And then last but not least, there is a term that has appeared now in the Iranian press, and that other Middle Eastern states say they've heard this as well, that there could be something called an inherent guarantee embedded in this deal. And what that means is that should the United States, under a future administration, much as Trump did in 2018, elect to leave the deal because they don't see this as being beneficial to the United States, or they see the Iranians cheating in some shape or form, that if the deal is left by a future administration, this would grant Iran the right to enrich uranium up to 60% and to install greater numbers of advanced centrifuges. And so what this deal does, when we talk about it being a bad deal, I would say the worst thing about it right now is that the negotiators appear to have chosen the side of the Iranian regime over future administrations without even knowing what their complaints might be. And so if this all happens, and that those are the reports out of Vienna, we could be seeing a terrible deal indeed.
There's one other issue which we've been hearing about, and you talked about the Iranian Revolutionary Guards being taken off terrorism lists, and the other things that you mentioned. I know there's one issue that both B'nai B'rith and FDD have been deeply involved in, and that relates to the Amia bombing in 1994, where Interpol is involved with these red notices regarding those who organized and perpetrated the bombing of the Jewish Social Welfare Center in Buenos Aires in 1994. So this seems to be kind of let's come clean on all of these outstanding issues. Not necessarily a good thing. So let me ask just one more question. If it's going to come down to this, what is the imperative here to play into the hands of the Iranians on all of these side issues, not to mention the sunset clauses, which, as you say, are going to expire shortly? What is the real imperative, given the state of the Iranians' malign behavior in the region, serial human rights abusers? Why the rush?
I wish I understood. I think the logic has been that the United States wishes to pivot to great power competition. I think it's clear now the imperative that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there's also, of course, the other competition with China. And the much vaunted pivot to Asia that the Obama administration failed to make. Trump began to make it, and we actually see it's one of the few areas of continuity between the Trump administration and Biden administration, this desire to roll back the growing influence of China on the world stage. And so we see that is, I think, likely the driving force behind this. But there's also, I think, a sense, and we've heard the administration say this on a number of occasions, they want to take this challenge, this Iranian nuclear challenge, and they want to put it in a box, and they want to put the box on a shelf, and they want to just put this whole thing behind us. The problem, of course, is that it will not go away. That this is a jack in the box. As my colleague Mark Dubowitz has put it, you will see Iran ultimately reach that status where it could make a bomb, it could make a dash to a bomb, and then the nuclear problem jumps out of the box and we have to deal with it again. The Israelis understand this. The Gulf states understand this. I think, to be honest, I think the Iranians and the United States understand this, and the point of this deal is to pretend that Iran is going to comply so that we can pretend to be focused elsewhere. But it will come back to haunt. The other thing that I'll just note, which has been an interesting wrinkle, is that at one point, a few days ago, it looked as if the United States was not willing to go any further with the deal. And the reason for that was that the Russians were demanding some kind of a carve-out from the Iran deal that would provide a white channel for sanctions evasion. To put it very bluntly, it would allow for the Iranians and Russians to continue to trade despite the sanctions against Russia. And the very notion that Russia was negotiating this, and the idea that both Russia and Iran would benefit from this deal, really, there was terrible optics for the United States, as if the optics weren't bad enough. And it appeared for a moment anyway that the negotiators were not going to allow this to proceed. But as we have now heard, recent reports suggest that the U.S. has caved to this as well, and so that the negotiations are back on track with a deal expected perhaps, I don't know, at some point this month.
Well, let's now turn to your book, Gaza Conflict 2021. Talk to us about the 11-day conflict between Israel and Hamas last May, how it concluded, and what led you to sit down and write about not only the most recent tensions, but what Western media failed to depict, I won't say understand, but to depict about the conflict.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, the book was something that I didn't expect to write, to put it mildly, but I watched the war as many of us did. It was 11 days of a fairly intense conflict. What was interesting to me is that the war was very predictable. These things, if you've watched enough of them, and this is, of course, the fourth major Gaza conflict since 2008, and if you've seen enough of these, you know that they have a very clear, kind of beginning and middle and end. It starts with a provocation, often justified by something political or religious, where Hamas begins launching rockets at Israel. Israel then responds, and things quickly escalate. At that point, Hamas tries to pull out new weaponry, new tactics, new strategies. The Israelis invariably neutralize those efforts, all the while striking pre-approved targets that have been accumulated over the course of months, if not years. These are usually approved targets, adjudicated by Israel's IDF and its Ministry of Justice. There's something almost rote about this whole process that Israel engages in. They don't want to reoccupy Gaza. They don't want to be there with boots on the ground. And over time, Hamas's capabilities are eroded. Israel finds itself under fire from the international community, from the international media. The pressure becomes great. Hamas loses steam. Eventually, a negotiator comes in. In this case, it was Egypt. In the past, it's been the United States or others. And eventually, the fighting subsides. A ceasefire is declared. And then Hamas begins accumulating weapons anew. Israel continues to monitor those targets and assesses a new target bank. And we find ourselves ready for yet another round. This is exactly what's happening now. But what is just truly amazing to me is the extent to which the media often ignores what is being portrayed in the Middle Eastern press, relevant stories, important stories that are taking place in Arabic or in Hebrew. They are ignored. Instead, what we see is that the media chooses to describe this as a broader Arab-Israeli conflict, which of course we know is shrinking in recent years, or even as a Palestinian-Israeli conflict when the West Bank is almost entirely quiet, and when the Gaza Strip is flooded with cash and weapons from outside powers that seek to use the Gaza Strip as a tool against Israel. And this is just simply ignored. Instead, Israel is cast as the aggressor, and the cycle begins anew. So what I tried to do here in this book, which I wrote in, we went from ceasefire to bookshelf in 166 days, which is not a publishing record in general, but was a record for me. My fourth book, by far the fastest written. But the point is to begin to debunk a lot of these false narratives before the next books come out. Invariably, they will come, and invariably, they will be very wrong on a number of key issues. So I tried to address a number of those key themes in this book.
Let me just follow up a little on the media, and then we'll talk about the conflict some more. Why is it that you just don't see footage of what's coming out of Gaza? I remember it wasn't the May conflict, but the one before, where there was, I think there was maybe a French station that went, and it was between two buildings, or it might have been in an UNRWA facility, and in between the two buildings, they showed the firing of the rockets. You don't see it. Now, I don't remember the name of the French media outlet that did this, but we know the major media outlets because we watch them here. We have the networks, and we've got the cable channels and so forth. If it's all so obvious to the naked eye, and these folks have their correspondents on the ground, it's not a secret exactly what's going on. What is it that perpetuates this reportage? And you're right. I mean, in the face of, let's say, the Abraham Accords, where you have countries that have normalized their relationship with Israel. They haven't abandoned the Palestinians, but they're saying, we've got to try a different way. So that we hope that will be the direction where the Middle East goes. And yet, media is still stuck in where it is. Why do you think?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is that there are restrictions inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas does not allow for Western reporters to be on the scene as their fighters are firing rockets blindly into Israeli airspace quite frankly, the hope of committing a war crime. That's not something that Hamas wishes to have publicized. And so there is very little video that you will ever see of reports along those lines. And that actually was something that came about. There was an interesting controversy that took place during the war itself. This is where Israel took out what was known as the Al-Jala Tower. This was the building that housed the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. And it turns out that Hamas had an office in this building where it was deploying advanced technology that was designed to jam Iron Dome, Israel's remarkably advanced technology that shoots rockets out of the sky when Hamas fires them. And this notion that the AP was not aware of a Hamas office in its own building was somewhat shocking to some. But as we have seen in the past, there are prominent journalists like Mati Friedman, if you recall, who published that groundbreaking piece in The Atlantic, where he accused the AP of just simply looking the other way in the face of Hamas military activity. It was just simply not reported. So that happens, I think, quite a bit in the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that this is a highly saturated story. Incredible numbers of journalists pour into the region every time there is a conflict, and yet we don't see what Hamas does. It is almost as if Israel is the only one firing shots during a war. Somehow these rockets find themselves in midair and Israel destroys them, but you can't see where they come from. When the rockets land in Israel, and in one case they hit a gas pipeline, creating a massive explosion inside of Israel, but you can't ever see who the perpetrators are. And that is, I think, a major failing of the Western media, of the global media in covering this story. But, there are other problems here as well. I think, if to be honest, I think there's a dose of anti-Semitism that is sprinkled in here, that Israel is held to different standards than other countries in responding to aggression from non-state actors or state actors, for that matter. There is, I think, also a tendency to just revert back to a very tired narrative that is devoid of all nuance. Because this is a story that sells, because the editors and journalists know what their audience looks for when they read about this particular conflict. But at the end of the day, I have to say, I was more unimpressed with the media this time around than I ever have been. And I'll give you one story that I think really underscores the failings. You may recall that it was on the third day of the conflict that there were reports, actually spurred by the IDF Twitter feed, that there were going to be Israeli boots on the ground fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And I recall that day looking at my Twitter feed and saying, okay, I got to go and watch this on television. So I turn on TV, I turn on Channel 11 and in Israel, and Channel 11's reporter says, I can't confirm this. I'm standing here on the border and I cannot confirm that there are troops on the ground. And by the way, nor can I get a confirmation from the IDF people that I know that there is a war happening. So I say, okay, that's one source. Let me turn it to Channel 13. Same thing. Reporter can't confirm. The anchors are saying we can't confirm. We don't know why the West is running with this story. And at the end of the day, it appears that the Israelis were trying to get Hamas to flood their, what is now known as their metro system of underground tunnels with commandos, so that Israel could carry out military operations to neutralize the tunnels and the commandos together. But the West, it was Western reporters, AP, New York Times, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, they all got the story wrong. And what they could have done is simply turn on the TV and watch in Hebrew, seeing these reporters saying that they could not confirm the story and that there was not a second source beyond the IDF Twitter feed. And this was just a major failing. And to me, what it demonstrated was that our reporters are not in tune with what is being reported in the Middle East. They are not watching what some of the best reporters in the world are saying about these conflicts. They're following a narrative that they wish to follow, but not one that is confirmed. And this is highly problematic and something that I hope can be corrected in future conflicts, although I have to say I don't hold out a lot of hope that it will be corrected.
When we were talking about Iran, you were talking about these precision-guided munitions, which are increasingly more accurate, that are flooding now into Hezbollah and to elsewhere in the north of Israel. Tell us about the Iranian relationship with Hamas and its rocket arsenal, and what's going in there now, and how is it getting in there?
So I love that question because I heard a lot of otherwise very smart people during the war claim that Iran had no fingerprints on this conflict. And it's because they say that you didn't see, Iranian advisors on the ground in the way that perhaps we've seen them in the past with Hezbollah, or that you didn't see specific variants being fired by Hamas that could be directly traced to Iran. And here's what I think people miss. It's that Hamas has existed since the late 1980s, probably 87, maybe early 88. Very soon after it was created and declared its intention to destroy Israel and to replace Israel with an Islamic Palestinian state, the Iranian regime began providing Hamas with a lot of money. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, perhaps even close to $1 billion when you start to add it up. Now, not only that, but they were taking Hamas leaders and Hamas commandos and training them in Tehran, training them in Sudan, back when Sudan was aligned with the Iranians before they normalized with Israel. They were being trained in Syria. They were being provided with weaponry that was being smuggled by way of naval vessels that arrived in Sudan. The weapons were then smuggled up to the Sinai Peninsula, and from the Sinai, the Bedouins would smuggle them into the Gaza Strip, usually through underground tunnels. Over the years, that assistance has changed as tactics have changed as well, and even in some cases, as after the Egyptian leadership change, after the Arab Spring, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has done actually quite a good job in curtailing that activity. But what the Iranians have done is they have, instead of providing the assistance directly, the military material, they have begun to teach Hamas how to do this themselves. They have afforded Hamas an independence of sorts. It's sort of that old adage, if you give a man a fish, they'll come back to you and ask for more. But if you teach a man to fish, they can feed themselves every day. Well, on a military level, Iran has taught Hamas how to fish. Hamas is now able to be relatively self-sufficient. There are still some things that are getting through, usually by naval smuggling, maritime vessels. And there we've seen some aerial drones, underwater drones, and perhaps some more dangerous variants of rockets. But, Israel does a fairly good job. They have, what we would describe as intelligence dominance inside the Gaza Strip. So they're able to prevent most of that, but they cannot stop the industrial process of homemade rocket building, which gets more and more sophisticated with every passing year. And the training of those commandos continues, the tunnel building continues, and so Hamas continues to evolve as a more advanced terrorist organization, and Israel is forced to fend it off. But much of this is Iranian assistance. There are other state sponsors. Turkey, Qatar, and even Malaysia are three other sponsors of Hamas activity, but Iran is far and away the most important patron of the Hamas terrorist organization.
I want to go back for a moment about the Palestinian tunnels. Israel seems to have come up with countermeasures that seem to be effective. Tell us about the Palestinian tunnel warfare, and do you still see the tunnels as significant threats going forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, I remember the 2014 war being that was the third Gaza war, being kind of an eye-opener for Israeli security officials. noting that there were tunnels that they had found that snaked into Israel and that they needed to be stopped. By the way, they also noted that there were Hamas frogmen who were not using tunnels, but were actually finding their way to Israel underwater, coming out and carrying out attacks against, in that case, the Zikim base in southern Israel, where a number of IDF soldiers were killed in that operation. But there was, I think, a general sense that Israel needed to do more to prevent that kind of activity. They came up with a system. It's not made entirely public yet, but they are able to dig beneath the ground and to identify where tunnels are being dug, and then to stop them, and then to ultimately destroy them. In some cases, actually watch for Hamas personnel and then to destroy them, so they can literally, sort of kill two birds with one stone. And so the Israelis have actually gotten quite good now at preventing the tunnels that snake into Israel and to prevent that kind of activity. And it extends out into the water as well. It extends deep underground. So these are advances. However, what we saw during the most recent conflict was a network of tunnels that were dug inside the Gaza Strip. It was a labyrinth designed to enable Hamas commandos to be able to pop up and kidnap or kill IDF personnel if and when there was a ground war. The Israelis were ready for this and destroyed it. The Israelis had good intelligence and were finally able to thwart what was a years-long project. But I think it's safe to say that Hamas has superior tunneling capabilities at this point, and that activity is going to continue. It will be something of a cat and mouse game. I think Israel has the upper hand for now, but that is by no means guaranteed in the future.
We have time for a couple of other questions, and I do want to get to Congress, because several members of Congress during the 2021 conflict said that it was, quote unquote, unfair that Israel had the Iron Dome missile defense system to protect its citizens, and that the U.S. should not only not replenish the Iron Dome, but condition aid to Israel. In other words, these members called for significantly less protection, not only for Israeli Jews, but for Israeli Arabs as well. This is truly, I think, one of the low points in American politics, at least as it relates to Congress and the state of Israel. What do you think brought us to this point where we have a number of members of the United States Congress calling to defund or to condition our close allies' defenses?
Look, this is obviously a growing problem. We've seen the fraying of the U.S. political system. It's been happening, obviously, for at least 5 years. I would probably argue more like 10 at this point. There is a small but vociferous group of Congress people that look at Israel as a liability, if not an adversary or even an enemy. Which is shocking given the role of Israel in the region, its importance to the United States as an ally, its moral and ethical alignment with the West. It is truly shocking to watch these members of Congress. I think in some cases they're motivated by anti-Semitism. In some cases they're motivated by a desire to realign the Middle East and tilt it towards the Iranians, which of course was a big part of the Iran nuclear deal that is currently being negotiated. But I would say that at this point, the so-called Hamas caucus has become impossible to ignore. And look, a couple of things to note. First, their calls for zeroing out of Iron Dome or withholding Iron Dome is ridiculous for a couple of reasons. One, I think rightly you note that it saves the lives of Palestinians as well as Israelis, as well as Israeli Arabs. That every time a rocket is knocked out of the air, as opposed to hitting Israel proper during a war, it actually gives the Israeli military brass the time and space and the comfort to be able to respond during a time of war with great care, great thought, great precision. And that has reduced the number of casualties over time. In fact, people talked about alleged war crimes carried out during this most recent conflict. the fact that there were roughly 250 casualties that occurred during this war is a testament to the precision and to the decision by the Israelis to hold back in their response against Hamas. And I think this is simply lost on these lawmakers. They don't understand how incredible this system is and how many lives it has saved. But the thing that really struck me during this war was that, for the first 9 days, I noted that the Israelis were incredibly thankful. They expressed thanks to the Biden administration repeatedly, briefing after briefing, that Biden had their back. The word in Hebrew is gibui. I heard it constantly on the Israeli media. And Biden seemed to be enjoying the fact that there was this close coordination and that he was really, I think, demonstrating his sort of commander-in-chief capabilities. But it all came to a grinding halt on day 9. Day 9 was the day that the ceasefire was unofficially announced, that the Egyptians had reached an agreement, and that within 2 days, a ceasefire would be enacted. It was at that moment that we began to see the White House talk about how it was done kidding around with Bibi, that the violence had gone on long enough, and that Israel needed to halt its offensive immediately. This was the kind of rhetoric that had started to leak out of the White House, even after 9 days of total support for Israel. And it became clear to me, at least at that moment, that this was an attempt to placate the squad, to placate the so-called Hamas caucus, that it was a sort of a blank check for the president. Now, I could say that on the one hand, we could argue that, look, the president still had Israel's back throughout this, and he did what was right, and that the Israelis were, in fact, rather pleased. The flip side of that, of course, is that the president still felt the need to message to the radical left within his party. And that is something that I think we all need to watch, because as they seek to zero out Iron Dome or to withhold advanced munitions to Israel, this could be a sort of way of having a sword dangling over Israel's head, and that is not a position that Israel wants to find itself. Not next year, not in 5 years, not in 10 years. And so the Israelis have, I think, some serious thinking to do about outreach to the United States and kind of how to mitigate the challenge of this small but again vociferous group of legislators.
Well, you've anticipated my final question, but perhaps you can amplify, and that is, what are some of the key ideas and conclusions that you would like people to take away from the book? Interestingly, you said 160 days, and that's probably, and right after the conflict, so everything was fresh in your mind. But clearly, looking ahead, who knows? God forbid that there should be something again. What are the takeaways? Looking at what do we learn, and what can we use from the book as we move ahead?
So, yeah, I mean, look, I would say, first of all, the book provides the history of Hamas. It provides a very clear template for how these wars take place. And they should be helpful for readers in anticipation of the next round of conflict, to be able to identify beginning, middle, and end of conflicts, the sort of trends that we've seen across these wars, what Hamas does to manipulate the media, how, quite frankly, the Israelis lose the narrative very early and very rarely regain it. But there are, I think, ways to mitigate some of this, and I get into it there. I think probably two other key lessons, two big takeaways. One is that the Iran deal, the looming Iran deal, could have really catastrophic effects on Israel. Primarily, we're looking at about $130 billion in sanctions relief that is set to be relinquished to the Islamic Republic. This invariably means that the Islamic Republic will be able to finance a range of terrorist groups that include the Houthis and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also Hamas. And this will put the United States in a very embarrassing position of funding both sides of the next Gaza war. There will be another war, And if this deal goes through, the United States will be indirectly responsible for funding Hamas and directly responsible for assisting Israel. This is not a position that a great power should be in. It's one thing to try to do that with the Iran-Iraq war, with two avowed enemies. It's another thing to do it with an ally of the United States and a terrorist organization that is funded by Iran. This is something that the United States really should avoid at all costs, and it's not too late, although it certainly appears that we're getting closer and closer to that fateful moment. And it's just really a horrific look for the Biden administration. The last thing that I'll just say here is that, it is clear that the map is changing. Geopolitics are changing. We can, I think, be sure of that after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but also the great power competition that is evolving with China, some of the other geopolitical trends that we're watching across the world. The idea that we are pivoting out of the Middle East is fine. I think the United States has, quite frankly, had it with the various conflicts that we have engaged in over there. Afghanistan, Iraq, war on terror. The United States is war weary, and that it seems that the public is ready to move on. I will maybe warn that sometimes even when you want to end conflicts, the enemy has a vote. And that doesn't mean that the United States will be able to pivot away without hearing something from Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of its other Middle Eastern foes. But the key here is that if we are going to try to leave the Middle East, we need to leave it in the hands of actors who will act in the American interest, who will try to preserve the American-led world order. And the key thing that I sort of touch on it as the book concludes is that, look, there are only a handful of actors that can actively preserve the US-led world order. You could maybe argue that the Emirates are one, the United Arab Emirates. Maybe you could argue that Bahrain or perhaps Saudi Arabia could also help. But Israel is by far the most advanced power in the region. It is the only democracy in the region. It is the only capable country of countering the likes of Iran and its proxies and allies. We need to empower Israel as we look to pivot away, not to condemn it, not to deprive it of the weaponry that it uses to neutralize the threats of its enemies. We need to make sure that Israel has all of the tools that it needs so that we can safely pivot out of the region and still ensure that the US-led world order prevails.
Well, the book is Gaza Conflict 2021 by Jonathan Schanzer, and it's available wherever you get your books. Jonathan, thank you for being here, discussing your new book, The Evolving Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Iran, Future of Middle East Policy, Ukraine, and so much more. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you.
Well, thanks again to Jonathan Chandser for joining us and sharing his analysis of the Middle East landscape in 2022. And thank you for tuning into this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Jonathan Chandser, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.